He spent years studying the minds of killers. He was pursuing a PhD in criminology at Washington State University, learning how investigators catch the most dangerous people in society. He studied crime scene protocols, interrogation techniques, the psychological profiles of serial murderers. He wrote papers on the psychology of Ted Bundy and asked detailed questions in class about how to break a suspect during an interrogation. He wanted to understand what drove someone across the line from thought to action. Then, in the early hours of November 13, 2022, everything he studied became more than academic theory. It became the blueprint for murder. This is the story of the Idaho student murders. Moscow, Idaho is a small city of just under 26,000 people, nestled in the rolling wheat fields of the Palouse region. The landscape here is unlike any other in America. The hills are not sharp or jagged like mountains. They are soft, rounded, sculptural, the product of thousands of years of wind and water shaping ancient glacial soil into waves of earth that stretch to every horizon. In the summer, these hills turn a deep, dusty gold that catches the evening light and glows as if lit from within. In the winter, they are covered in a blanket of green winter wheat that makes the whole region look like it belongs on a postcard. The University of Idaho sits at the center of Moscow, a campus of red brick buildings and tall trees occupying over 1,000 acres of what was once farmland. Founded in 1889, the university has been the heart of this town for well over a century. In late autumn, the air takes on that sharp, clean cold that tells you winter is coming. Students walk between classes with their hands shoved deep into coat pockets, their breath forming small clouds in the cold morning air. The coffee shops on Main Street fill with the sound of laptops and quiet conversation. The warmth inside is a stark contrast to the gray cold outside. Moscow is a quiet town, a safe town. The crime rate in Latah County is well below the national average. For most violent crimes, it is less than half of what you would find in a typical American city. This is the kind of place where people still leave their doors unlocked when they run to the grocery store, where neighbors know each other by name and wave from their front porches, where the biggest news story in a typical year is a fender bender at the intersection of Main and 6th Street, or a drunk and disorderly on a Friday night that gets resolved before anyone gets hurt. Parents send their children to the University of Idaho because it feels like the kind of place where nothing bad can happen. And statistically, they are right to feel that way. Statistics do not prevent tragedy. They only describe how unlikely it is. And on November 13, 2022, the unlikely became reality. Madison Mogen was 21 years old. She was born on October 3, 2001, and grew up in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, a resort town on the shores of a glacial lake so clear and blue that it looks almost artificial. The town is surrounded by pine-covered mountains, and in winter the snow falls heavy and white and clean. It is the kind of place where people go to escape chaos, to find peace in nature. Madison embodied that spirit. She was warm, genuine, someone who made people feel at ease just by being in the room. Her father, Ben, described her as his best friend, someone who brought light into every room she entered. She worked at a restaurant called the Mad Greek on Main Street, where her coworkers remembered her energy and warmth, the way she could turn a bad shift into a good one with a single joke or a kind word. On the night she died, Madison was wearing a black top with a sweetheart neckline and a small heart pendant on a delicate chain around her neck. Her last known photograph shows her at the Corner Club in downtown Moscow, the warm amber light of the bar illuminating her face from the side. She is smiling, not a posed smile, but a genuine one. The smile of a young woman who is exactly where she wants to be, surrounded by people she loves on a Saturday night that still felt full of possibility. She had recently been promoted at work and was excited about her future. She had no way of knowing that her future was only hours long. Kaylee Goncalves was also 21 years old. She was born on July 13, 2001, and grew up in Rathdrum, Idaho. She and Madison had been best friends since they were children, the kind of bond that forms in kindergarten and only deepens over time, the kind where you do not need to speak to know what the other person is thinking. They attended the same elementary school, the same middle school, the same high school. They did everything together and were almost never apart. Kaylee had just graduated from the University of Idaho with a degree in general studies and was weeks away from moving to Austin, Texas. She had already bought a brand new Range Rover and found an apartment. She was ready for the next chapter. Her sister Olivia described her as a force of nature, someone who lived life out loud, who was adventurous and fearless and full of plans. On the night before she died, Kaylee called her ex-boyfriend Jack Ducour repeatedly between 2:30 and 300 in the morning. Some of the calls went to voicemail. One was answered but lasted only a few seconds. Kaylee sounded excited about her move to Austin, talking about the life she was about to start. She was trying to share her joy with someone she still cared about. Xana Kernodle was 20 years old. She was born on June 19, 2002, in Post Falls, Idaho. She was studying marketing at the university and worked at the Mad Greek alongside Madison, where the two had become close friends through their shared shifts. Xana was known for her quiet kindness, the kind of person who remembered your birthday when no one else did, who asked how your day was going and actually wanted to know the answer. She called her mother every single night before bed. It was a FaceTime call, a ritual that had continued from high school through college. On the night of November 12th, she talked to her mother around 10:30 p.m. It was a shorter call than usual because she was at a party. Her mother said that if she had known it would be the last time, she would have stayed on the phone longer. Ethan Chapin was 20 years old. He was born on June 8, 2002. He was a triplet identical to his brother Hunter, with a sister named Maisie, and the three siblings were inseparable. Growing up, they were known everywhere as the Chapin triplets, always together, always looking out for each other. Ethan was described by friends as the calmest person in any room, someone who could diffuse tension with a single sentence. He was a member of the Sigma Chi fraternity at the University of Idaho and was studying recreation, sport, and tourism management. He was visiting Xana that weekend, as he often did, and had spent the evening at the Sigma Chi fraternity house playing beer pong with his brothers. He was planning to transfer to the University of Montana in the spring to be closer to his siblings. He was looking forward to being with them again, and to the life he and Xana were building together. On the night of November 12th into the morning of November 13th, these four young people were in different places, living different moments of the same evening. Madison and Kaylee were at the Corner Club, a bar on Main Street in downtown Moscow, laughing and taking photos together. The last photo of Madison alive shows her smiling in the warm amber light of the bar, her eyes bright, her whole face radiating the easy happiness of a night out with her best friend. They ordered food from the grub truck on their way home, a late-night food truck that served the college crowd. Xana and Ethan were at a party at the Sigma Chi fraternity house, the house loud with music and conversation, then walked back to the King Road house, hand in hand through the cold November air. The last text message from Kaylee was sent at 2:52 in the morning. It was to her ex-boyfriend Jack. She called him repeatedly after that. He did not answer. The calls went to voicemail. The house at 1122 King Road is a 3-story building on a corner lot, painted a light gray color with white trim. It sits at the edge of a residential neighborhood not far from the university campus. The floor plan is unusual. The main entrance is on the 2nd floor, reached by a set of wooden stairs that climbs from the ground level. You enter into a common area with a kitchen and living room, the heart of the home, where the roommates would gather to watch movies, eat takeout, study for exams. From there, a staircase goes up to the 3rd floor and another goes down to the 1st. The layout is confusing even to people who have visited before. Doors lead to unexpected places. The rooms are arranged in a way that makes it difficult for sound to carry from one part of the house to another. On the 3rd floor, Madison and Kaylee had bedrooms next to each other. They often shared a bed in one room or the other, the way best friends do when they have known each other since childhood, and sleeping in the same bed feels as natural as breathing. On the 2nd floor, Xana had a bedroom near the living room. Down the hall, DM had another bedroom. Bethany Funky's room was also on the 2nd floor. The sliding glass door on the 2nd floor opened onto a small balcony that overlooked the backyard. It was not a secure door by any measure, the kind that can be jimmied open with a credit card. Friends who visited the house regularly knew that the door was often left unlocked for convenience. In the days before the murders, neighbors noticed a white sedan driving slowly past the house. It would circle the block, pause, and drive away. It would return hours later and do the same thing. The neighbors noticed, but in a college town, unfamiliar cars are common. No one thought much of it. But in retrospect, that white sedan was conducting reconnaissance. The driver was learning the pattern of the house, the way the streets connected, the potential escape routes, the rhythm of the neighborhood at night. At approximately 300 in the morning, a white Hyundai Elantra began circling the area around King Road. Law enforcement would later trace this vehicle through license plate readers and surveillance cameras placed throughout the neighborhood. It appeared in the area multiple times, passing the house, circling back, passing again. Cell phone data later obtained by investigators placed Koberger's phone in the vicinity of the King Road house 12 separate times between 12:30 a.m. and 3 a.m. on the morning of November 13th. At approximately 4 a.m., the car parked somewhere nearby. Someone got out and began walking toward the house. At that same time, Xana Kernadol was awake in her second-floor bedroom. Cell phone data shows she was active on her phone, scrolling through TikTok at exactly 400 in the morning. She may have heard something that disturbed her sleep. The sound of a car approaching, gravel crunching under careful footsteps, the sliding glass door opening on its track. She was on her phone, waiting in the darkness, perhaps listening to the sounds of the house around her. The killer entered through the sliding glass door on the second floor. It was unlocked. The door slid open silently on its aluminum track. He stepped into the common area carrying a Ka-bar knife, a fixed-blade combat knife, with a 7-inch blade and a distinctive black handle, the kind issued to the United States Marine Corps. The knife was sheathed in a leather sheath with a metal snap button. At some point during the entry, or perhaps during the attack itself, that snap button would come undone, and the sheath would be left behind on Madison Mogen's bed. He moved through the house with purpose, not like someone who was searching, but like someone who had studied the layout and knew exactly where he was going. He bypassed DM's room on the second floor. He went up the stairs to the third floor. On the third floor, Madison and Kaylee were asleep in Madison's bed. They were lying close together as they always did. There was no warning. The medical examiner would later determine that Kaylee was attacked first. Her wounds were more extensive, suggesting she may have woken during the attack and tried to defend herself. Her hands showed defensive injuries, the kind that come from trying to push away a knife blade. Madison's wound suggested she may never have woken at all. Both died in the same bed where they had fallen asleep, in the same room where they had been laughing just hours before. On the second floor, Xana heard something. Perhaps the commotion from upstairs, the thud of bodies, the sounds of a struggle. Perhaps footsteps on the stairs. She got out of bed. There was a struggle. Defensive wounds on her hands and arms showed that she fought back, that she tried to protect herself with her bare hands against a man armed with a military combat knife. She did not go quietly. Ethan Chapin was asleep in Xana's bed. He may have woken during the struggle and tried to intervene. He was also killed. The killer left the second-floor bedroom and walked down the hallway. DM, the surviving roommate, had been in her bedroom on the second floor. She later told investigators that she heard what she initially described as the sound of someone playing with a dog, a repetitive thumping sound, like a ball being dropped on the floor. She also heard what she believed was crying. Then she heard a male voice say something that sounded like, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." She opened her bedroom door a crack and looked out into the hallway. What she saw was a man walking toward her, dressed entirely in black clothing, wearing a mask that covered his mouth and nose. His eyebrows were prominent, bushy, and that single visual detail would stick in her memory with photographic clarity. He walked past her, close enough that she could have reached out and touched him if she had tried. He did not look at her. He did not speak a word. He walked to the sliding glass door, stepped outside onto the balcony, and disappeared into the November night. DM locked her bedroom door immediately and did not come out again until the next morning. At 4:17 in the morning, a license plate reader on the highway captured the white Hyundai Elantra leaving the area at high speed. The killer was gone. The morning of November 13th arrived gray and cold over Moscow. A friend who had been with Madison and Kaylee at the corner club the night before began calling them around 11:30 in the morning. No one answered. She called again. Nothing. She drove to the house. Everything looked normal from the outside. The cars were in the driveway. The house looked quiet. Nothing seemed out of place, but something felt wrong. A heavy feeling in her chest that she could not explain. At 11:58 in the morning, she called 911. The call was placed from inside the house by one of the surviving roommates. The dispatcher heard a female voice say, "I think there's an unconscious person." The dispatcher asked clarifying questions. The voice responded, "My friend just found someone and we think they're not breathing." An officer was dispatched. The officer arrived at the house and knocked on the door. No answer. He walked around the property. The sliding glass door on the second floor was partially open. He entered the house and climbed the stairs to the third floor. What he found stopped him cold. 2 young women in the same bed, both deceased. The scene was clearly a violent homicide. He immediately called for backup and secured the scene. When additional officers arrived, they conducted a methodical search of the house. On the second floor, they found 2 more victims, Xana Kernodle and Ethan Chapin, DM, and Bethany Funke were found alive in their respective bedrooms. They had slept through the attack, or through most of it. They had no idea what had happened only a few feet away. The Moscow Police Department had never handled a crime scene of this magnitude. The chief of police described it as something out of a nightmare. 4 young people brutally killed in their own home, with no sign of forced entry, no witnesses to the actual killings, and, at first, no obvious suspects. The house was cordoned off. Evidence markers were placed. Forensic teams arrived from across the state. The FBI was called in, and news helicopters began circling overhead, their cameras capturing images that would be broadcast across the country. On the bed where Madison Mogan and Kaylee Goncalves lay, investigators found a leather knife sheath. It was military style, designed to hold a KA bar fixed blade knife. The sheath was made of black leather with a metal snap button at the top that clicked shut to secure the knife. On that snap button, forensic analysts later recovered a single-source male DNA profile. The profile did not match any of the victims. It did not match any of the surviving roommates. It did not match any of the friends or family members who had been in the house in the preceding days. The killer had left his DNA at the scene. Investigators also collected other evidence from the house. They lifted footprints from the hallway, impressions of a boot or shoe that did not match any footwear owned by the residents. They collected fibers from the carpet. They gathered trace evidence from the bedding. They lifted fingerprints from the sliding glass door. The pattern of wounds on the victims suggested a specific type of knife, a large fixed blade with a smooth edge on one side and a serrated edge on the other. The KA bar matched this description perfectly. The knife itself was never found. Investigators believe Koberger may have disposed of it during his cross-country drive from Washington to Pennsylvania, throwing it into a river or burying it in a remote area. Despite extensive searches along the route, the murder weapon has never been recovered. The weeks following the murders were a blur of activity. The Moscow Police Department called in the Idaho State Police and the FBI. Hundreds of people were interviewed. Hours of surveillance footage were reviewed. Thousands of tips were investigated. The investigation focused on 3 main threads. First, the knife sheath. The DNA profile was uploaded to CODIS, the National DNA Database, but it did not match any known offender. This was a suspect with no criminal record. Investigators turned to investigative genetic genealogy, the same technique that had been used to catch the Golden State Killer. By uploading the DNA profile to public genealogy databases, they could search for relatives of the suspect and then work their way down the family tree to identify the individual. The process required court orders, the cooperation of genealogy companies, and painstaking detective work. In early December 2022, the genealogy search identified a potential relative, a third cousin of the suspect. From there, investigators built a family tree and identified Brian Koberger as a person of interest based on his age, his location in Pullman, Washington, and the make and model of his car. Second, the white Hyundai Elantra. The car had been captured on multiple surveillance cameras circling the neighborhood in the hours before and after the murders. Investigators began checking registration records for all white Elantras in the region. In a college town with students from across the country, there were hundreds of such vehicles on the road. But one Elantra, registered in Pennsylvania to a 28-year-old PhD student, stood out. Third, cell phone data. Investigators obtained warrants for data from cell towers serving the area around King Road. They mapped every phone that had pinged those towers between 300 and 500 in the morning on November 13th. Thousands of phones appeared in the data, residents, students, drivers passing through on the highway. Filtering through them to find the one that did not belong was the investigative equivalent of searching for a needle in a stack of needles. For 6 weeks, the investigation continued quietly behind the scenes. The families waited. The public speculated. The Moscow Police Department maintained a deliberate silence. On December 19, 2022, investigators had a name: Brian Kohberger. They did not arrest him immediately. They watched him, they tracked his movements, they collected DNA from the trash outside his family's home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, where he had gone for the winter holidays. The trash contained a pizza box, coffee cups, and other personal items from which forensic analysts extracted a DNA sample. The sample was compared to the DNA from the knife sheath. It was a match. The statistical probability that the DNA belonged to someone other than Brian Kohberger was less than 1 in 5.37 octillion, a number so large it is almost impossible to comprehend. The match was effectively unique to him. On December 30th, 2022, a team of FBI agents and Pennsylvania state troopers surrounded the Kohberger family home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. Inside was Brian Kohberger, 28 years old, visiting his parents for the holidays. He had just completed his first semester as a PhD student in criminal justice and criminology at Washington State University in Pullman, Washington, a drive of just 15 minutes from Moscow, Idaho. Earlier that month, Kohberger had driven from Pullman to Pennsylvania with his father. The journey covered over 2,400 miles across several states over multiple days. During the drive, on December 15th, they were pulled over by an Indiana state trooper for following too closely. The traffic stop occurred on Interstate 70 west of Indianapolis. Body cam footage from the trooper shows Kohberger in the driver's seat, his father in the passenger seat. The conversation is mundane, explaining the purpose of the trip, discussing their destination. The trooper issued a warning. The stop lasted only a few minutes. In retrospect, it takes on a different significance. An officer unknowingly had his body cam trained on a quadruple homicide suspect. Kohberger was taken into custody without incident. He was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary. The news of the arrest sent shockwaves through the true crime community. The probable cause affidavit laid out the evidence. The DNA on the knife sheath matched Kohberger with a statistical probability of less than 1 in 5.37 octillion. His white Hyundai Elantra had been captured on surveillance cameras near the King Road house. His cell phone data placed him in the area during the critical hours. In the weeks before the murders, his phone had pinged towers near the house on multiple occasions. He waived extradition and was flown back to Idaho on a private plane, arriving at the Pullman-Moscow Regional Airport, a short distance from the scene of the crime. Brian Christopher Kohberger was born on November 21, 1994, in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. His father worked as an auditor. His mother was a home health aide. He had 2 older sisters. The family was close-knit. In high school, the picture began to shift. Kohberger was described by classmates as someone who kept to himself, who seemed different in ways his peers could not articulate. He was bullied, sometimes cruelly. He struggled with substance abuse in his teens, including heroin, according to early reports. He had a brush with the law for shoplifting in 2009, but no serious juvenile record. He graduated from high school in 2013 and enrolled at DeSales University, a small Catholic university in Center Valley, Pennsylvania. It was at DeSales that Kohberger discovered his passion for criminal justice. He dove into the subject with an intensity that surprised his professors. He studied psychology and criminal behavior, earning a bachelor's degree summa cum laude in 2018. He continued at DeSales for a master's degree, completing his thesis in 2020. His research examined how emotions like shame and guilt influence criminal decision-making. But it was not just his formal education that revealed his interests. On his computer, investigators later found a research paper he had written titled "The Psychological Autopsy of Ted Bundy, Analyzing the Famous Serial Killer's Childhood, His Narcissism, and His Modus Operandi." In a research proposal, Kohberger wrote, "I want to understand how offenders think, what makes them cross that line." After completing his master's degree, Kohberger struggled. He worked briefly for the family business. He lived at home. He applied for jobs in law enforcement, but was never hired. In the fall of 2022, he enrolled in the PhD program at Washington State University in Pullman, Washington. 3 months later, he was arrested for the murder of 4 people. During his time at Washington State, Kohberger's behavior raised eyebrows. In one class discussion, he asked his professor, if a suspect is innocent, wouldn't they confess just to avoid the stress of interrogation? In another class, he asked about the best way to clean a crime scene to avoid DNA detection. His questions made classmates uneasy. Under the username Exponents, he posted on Reddit asking about interrogation techniques for psychopaths and what makes a serial killer. The posts read like someone trying to understand the criminal mind or someone trying to learn how to evade it. In the weeks before the murders, his behavior changed. He became withdrawn. He stopped responding to emails from his professors. He was seen driving his white Elantra late at night, alone, circling the streets of Pullman and Moscow. The question that has never been answered, was Kohberger studying criminal behavior to understand it, or to get better at committing it? After the arrest, investigators searched Kohberger's on-campus apartment in Pullman. It was sparsely furnished, a desk with a laptop, textbooks on criminology, papers he had been working on. The apartment was clean, almost sterile, as if he had been preparing for someone to search it. In the trash, investigators found items suggesting he had been cleaning with bleach. The interior of his Hyundai Elantra had been thoroughly cleaned, vacuumed, wiped down, as if he had been trying to remove evidence. But trace evidence remained. Fibers, hair, microscopic particles that no amount of cleaning can fully remove. On his computer, investigators found search histories related to criminal psychology, serial murder, and police investigation techniques. He had searched for information about the King Road house, its layout, its residents, the surrounding neighborhood. He had searched for the names of his victims. He had downloaded maps of the area. Kohberger appeared in court for the first time in January 2023, calm and composed. He answered the judge's questions in a clear voice. His attorneys entered a plea of not guilty on his behalf. The defense team, led by Ann Taylor, immediately began challenging the prosecution's evidence. They filed multiple motions to suppress the DNA evidence, arguing that the methods used to collect and analyze it violated Kohberger's constitutional rights. They argued that the genetic genealogy search was an unconstitutional search. They challenged the reliability of the cell phone location data. They argued that the grand jury process had been fundamentally unfair. The prosecution, led by the Lada County Prosecutor's Office with support from the Idaho Attorney General's Office, maintained that the evidence was solid, legally obtained, and overwhelming. The DNA on the knife sheath was the strongest piece of physical evidence in any murder case in recent memory. The cell phone data placed Kohberger at the scene. The car sightings and license plate data placed him in the neighborhood. A gag order was imposed early in the case, preventing attorneys, law enforcement, and family members from speaking publicly about the evidence. The order was designed to protect Kohberger's right to a fair trial, but it has been the subject of repeated challenges by media organizations and by the victims' families themselves. The legal wrangling continued through 2023, 2024, and into 2025. Motion after motion was filed. Hearing after hearing was held. The families of the victims attended every single one, sitting in the front row, watching the man accused of killing their children. In April 2025, the judge denied the defense's motion to suppress the DNA evidence. The ruling was a major victory for the prosecution. The knife sheath DNA would be admissible at trial. The genetic genealogy evidence could be presented. The trash pull DNA was lawful. The trial was set for August 11, 2025. DM's account of what she saw that night has been the subject of intense scrutiny and, at times, criticism. She was in her bedroom on the second floor when she heard what she described as playful noises from the third floor, what she thought were the sounds of her roommates having fun after a night out. Then she heard a thud, then crying, then a male voice saying, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." She opened her door and saw the masked figure walking past her. She described having a clear view of his eyebrows, bushy, prominent, distinctive. She said he was about 5'10" to 6 duro tall, not overly muscular, dressed all in black. She watched as he walked to the sliding glass door and left. Her decision not to call 911 has been questioned in online forums and by armchair detectives. Why did she not call immediately? Why did she wait until the next morning? Investigators have defended her. She was in shock. She may not have fully understood what she had witnessed. She later told investigators that she thought the person might have been a friend of one of the roommates. She thought the crying might have been someone playing rough. She did not see a weapon. In the dark, in the confusion, she made the choice to protect herself by locking her door. Sometimes the human mind refuses to accept what it sees. It finds explanations, any explanation, rather than confront the truth. As the trial approaches, several questions remain unanswered. Why did Kohberger target that specific house? There is no evidence that he knew any of the victims personally. He did not attend the University of Idaho. He did not socialize in the same circles. Investigators have found no connection between him and anyone who lived at 11122 King Road. Why did the surviving roommate survive? Was Kohberger unaware of her presence? Did he see her and decide for whatever reason not to harm her? Was there something about the timing, the need to leave before being discovered, that made him bypass her room? Was this the only time? Investigators have quietly reviewed unsolved murders and disappearances along the route between Pennsylvania and Washington state. No definitive links have been established, but the question of whether Kohberger had killed before will likely be examined at trial. The families of the victims have been living with their loss for nearly 3 years. They have transformed their grief into advocacy. The Mogan family established the Madison Mogan Memorial Scholarship at the University of Idaho for students pursuing marketing. The Goncalves family created a scholarship in Kaylee's name at her high school. The Kernodle family launched the Xana Kernodle Foundation to support victims of violent crime, and they hold an annual walk in her memory. The Chapin family established scholarships in Ethan's name at his high school and at the University of Idaho. The 4 families have united to support victims' rights legislation in Idaho, particularly around gag orders that prevent families from speaking publicly about ongoing cases. They have become advocates, activists, voices for change in a system that they feel has not always served them well. In August of 2025, a jury in Lata County, Idaho will hear the case against Brian Kohberger. They will hear about the knife sheath and the DNA and the car and the phone records. They will hear from the surviving roommate. They will hear from the forensic experts and the FBI agents. They will hear from the families. They will be asked to decide the fate of a man who spent his life studying the criminal mind. For the families of Madison Mogan, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, the trial represents the possibility of justice. But no verdict, no matter how just, will bring back the 4 young people who died on that November night. The innocence that Moscow once had is gone. It was taken on a cold autumn morning in a 3-story house on King Road by a man who walked in through a sliding glass door, did what he came to do, and walked out again into the darkness. In the quiet town of Moscow, Idaho, the wheat fields still roll under the wide open sky. The students still walk to class. The coffee shops still fill with the sound of conversation. But the sliding glass door at 1122 King Road stays locked now. Madison Mogan was not just a face in a photograph. She was the kind of person who made the world feel smaller and warmer. Her father, Ben, recalled that she called him every day, sometimes just to say hello, sometimes to share something funny that happened in class. She had a habit of leaving little notes around the house for her family, sticky notes with smiley faces and encouraging messages. At the Mad Greek where she worked, Regular customers would specifically ask for her table because they loved her energy. One coworker remembered that she could be having the worst day, and Madison would find a way to make her laugh. She was studying marketing because she wanted to work in social media, creating content that made people feel connected. Kaylee Goncalves had been counting down the days until her move to Austin. She had already shipped some of her belongings ahead and had been researching coffee shops and hiking trails near her new apartment. She was the kind of person who threw herself into new experiences with both feet. Her sister Olivia remembered that when Kaylee decided she wanted to go to the University of Idaho, she visited the campus once and immediately knew it was the right place. She just decided, and that was it, Olivia said in an interview. That was Kaylee. She made up her mind, and there was no changing it. Xana Kernadle's nightly FaceTime calls with her mother were not just quick check-ins. They could last an hour. Xana would talk about her classes, her friends, what she was learning, and her marketing courses. Her mother, Crystal, said that if she had missed a call, Xana would text her immediately, "Mom, you okay?" The calls were a lifeline between mother and daughter, a thread that connected two worlds. When Crystal testified about her daughter's last call, she said it was shorter than usual because Xana was getting ready to go out. "I told her I loved her and she said it back," Crystal remembered. "I had no idea it would be the last time." Ethan Chapin's triplet siblings described him as the glue of their group. When Hunter was struggling with something, Ethan was the one who would sit with him and talk it through. When Maisie was upset, Ethan would make her laugh. He had a way of reading people's moods and knowing exactly what they needed. His mother, Stacy, remembered that even as a young child, Ethan was the one who mediated fights between his siblings. "He just had this calm about him," she said. "Nothing ever seemed to rattle him." The investigative genetic genealogy used to identify Brian Kohberger is a technique that has revolutionized cold case investigations. It works by uploading a crime scene DNA profile to public genealogy databases where millions of people have submitted their DNA for ancestry research. The software then identifies relatives of the unknown suspect, third cousins, second cousins, distant family members, and constructs a massive family tree. In the Idaho case, the process identified a third cousin of the suspect within days of uploading the profile. From there, a team of genealogists worked backward, building branches of the family tree, and then forward again, identifying every male in the right age range who lived in the Pacific Northwest. The process narrowed the field from thousands of possibilities to a handful of names. One of those names was Brian Kohberger. The defense has challenged this technique as an unconstitutional search. They argue that the Fourth Amendment protects against warrantless searches of genetic data. The prosecution counters that Kohberger had no reasonable expectation of privacy in DNA he voluntarily left at a crime scene. The April 2025 ruling sided with the prosecution, meaning the genealogy evidence can be presented at trial. Forensic psychologists and criminal profilers have offered their analysis of Kohberger's psychology, even without having examined him directly. Dr. Catherine Ramsland, a professor of forensic psychology and author of several books on criminal profiling, noted that his academic focus on serial killers suggested a fascination that may have crossed from intellectual curiosity into dangerous fantasy. The fact that he chose a Ka bar knife, a military weapon, indicates a desire for dominance and control, she said in an interview. Former FBI profiler Mary Ellen O'Toole analyzed the "I'm going to help you" comment heard by the surviving roommate. That statement suggests a fantasy of being a rescuer or a figure of authority, O'Toole said. It could be a form of psychological control, asserting dominance over the victim in their final moments. It is unusual and potentially very revealing about his psychology. They are the actions of someone who believed he was smarter than the system, someone who thought he would never be caught. The University of Idaho canceled classes for the week following the murders. The entire campus went into mourning. A memorial service was held at the Kibbe Dome, the university's indoor stadium, where thousands of students, faculty, and community members gathered to remember 4 of their own. The governor of Idaho attended. The mayor of Moscow spoke. Each victim's family was invited to share memories. The house at 1122 King Road became an unofficial memorial. Students and community members left flowers, candles, handwritten notes, and stuffed animals. The front porch was covered in tributes, so many that they spilled onto the lawn. The house itself was sealed as a crime scene, its interior preserved exactly as it had been on the morning of November 13th. It would remain empty for months, a silent monument to the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. The town of Moscow struggled to process what had happened. People who had always felt safe in their homes suddenly found themselves checking their locks at night. Parents who had never worried about their college-aged children began calling them every evening. The innocence that the town had taken for granted was gone, replaced by a vigilance that no one had asked for, but that everyone now carried. The trial of Bryan Kohberger, scheduled to begin August 11, 2025, is expected to last between 6 and 8 weeks. Jury selection alone could take weeks, given the intense publicity the case has received. The defense has requested a change of venue, arguing that potential jurors in Latah County have been so saturated with news coverage that an impartial jury cannot be seated. The trial will feature testimony from dozens of witnesses, including forensic experts, FBI agents, cell phone analysts, DNA specialists, and the surviving roommate. The prosecution is expected to present a case that is almost entirely circumstantial. There is no eyewitness to the actual murders and no murder weapon. But the circumstantial evidence is so overwhelming that legal experts consider a conviction likely. The defense strategy appears to be centered on challenging the reliability of the DNA evidence and the cell phone data, while also questioning DM's identification of the suspect. The defense may also argue that alternate suspects were not adequately investigated. For the families, the trial represents the final chapter in a long and painful journey. They have waited nearly 3 years for this moment. They have attended every hearing, every motion, every procedural argument. They have sat in the front row and watched the man accused of killing their children. They have been patient when patience seemed impossible. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Idaho student murders is not what we know, but what we may never know. Why did Bryan Kohberger choose that house? Why did he choose those 4 people? Was there a specific target, or was it a random act of violence? Investigators have not found any evidence that Kohberger knew Madison, Kaylee, Xana, or Ethan. He did not attend the same school. He did not socialize in the same circles. He did not interact with them online or in person, as far as anyone can determine. The randomness of the selection, if it was random, is perhaps the most terrifying possibility of all. And then there is the question that haunts the case more than any other. Why did the surviving roommate survive? DM was in the same hallway, on the same floor, within arm's reach of the killer. He walked past her. He saw her, she was certain of that. And yet he did not harm her. Was he in a hurry to leave? Did her presence surprise him? Did he simply not consider her a threat? The question has no answer, and it never will. The trial of Bryan Kohberger may answer some of these questions, but the ones it cannot answer, the whys and the what-ifs, will linger long after the verdict is read. The investigation into the Idaho student murders was one of the most intensive in Idaho history. The FBI dispatched a team of over 40 agents to Moscow within days of the murders. The Idaho State Police assigned dozens of detectives. The Latah County Prosecutor's Office was involved from the beginning. The coordination between agencies was unprecedented for a case of this type in a town this size. The cell phone data analysis alone consumed thousands of man-hours. Investigators obtained records from multiple cell phone providers covering the area around King Road. They mapped every device that had connected to the tower serving the neighborhood between 10 p.m. on November 12th and 8 a.m. on November 13th. The dataset included thousands of phones, each one a potential lead. The process of elimination was painstaking. Investigators eliminated phones belonging to residents of the neighborhood. They eliminated phones belonging to students who lived nearby. They eliminated phones that belonged to known visitors, delivery drivers, ride-share drivers. One by one, the phones were ruled out until a small number of unexplained devices remained. Kohberger's phone was among them. It had pinged the tower at 2:47 a.m., again at 3:01 a.m., again at 3:15 a.m., again at 3:30 a.m., again at 3:42 a.m., again at 3:54 a.m., again at 4:04 a.m. The pattern showed the phone moving around the neighborhood, circling, returning, pausing. At 4:17 a.m., the phone stopped pinging the Moscow tower and began connecting to towers south of town, toward Pullman. At 4:48 a.m., it connected to a tower in Pullman, near the Washington State University campus. The Hyundai Elantra was traced through an equally painstaking process. License plate readers captured images of the car at multiple locations on the night of the murders and in the days that followed. Investigators worked with the manufacturer to determine the exact model year and features of the car in the images. They determined it was a 2011 to 2016 Hyundai Elantra in white, a common car, but one that could be narrowed down through registration records. The breakthrough came when investigators cross-referenced the Elantra registrations with the list of phones that had pinged the King Road Tower in the early morning hours of November 13th. The intersection of those two datasets produced a very short list of names. Brian Kohberger was on that list. The gag order imposed by Judge Megan Marshall in January 2023 was intended to protect Kohberger's right to a fair trial. But it also had the effect of keeping the victims' families from speaking publicly about their children. The Goncalves family was most vocal in their opposition. Steve Goncalves, Kaylee's father, gave multiple media interviews in apparent violation of the gag order. In one interview, he said, "I'm a father who lost his daughter. I have a right to speak about her. No court order can take that away." The judge declined to penalize him, acknowledging the unique circumstances of the case. But the tension between the gag order and the family's desire to speak publicly has been a recurring theme throughout the pretrial proceedings. Media organizations, including major news networks, have also challenged the gag order. They argue that the public has a right to know about the case, especially given its significance. The court has largely maintained the order, citing the need to ensure a fair trial. The house at 1122 King Road has become something of a landmark, though not one the neighborhood asked for. In the months after the murders, it stood empty, cordoned off by police tape and surrounded by flowers. The university offered counseling services to students who lived nearby. The landlord eventually offered to release the surviving tenants from their leases. In early 2023, the house was cleaned by a biohazard remediation company. The interior was gutted and restored. The landlord put the property up for sale, but there were no takers. A house where 4 people were brutally murdered is not an easy sell, especially in a small town where everyone knows the story. The house has since been donated to the local fire department for training exercises. Firefighters use it to practice search and rescue operations, entering the building in full gear, moving through the confusing layout. The irony is not lost on anyone. A house that was the scene of such violence now serves a purpose that saves lives. The timeline of the night of the murders has been pieced together from multiple sources: cell phone data, surveillance footage, witness accounts, and forensic analysis. Here is what investigators believe happened, minute by minute. At 3 a.m., the white Elantra is captured on a neighbor's security camera, driving past the King Road house for the first time that night. The car circles the block and returns at 3:12 a.m. It circles again at 3:24 a.m. At 3:38 a.m., it pauses on the street near the house. At 3:45 a.m., it circles again. At 3:52 a.m., it circles again. At 3:58 a.m., it circles again. At 3:58 a.m., it circles again. At 4 a.m., the car parks on a side street and the driver gets out. At 4:04 a.m., a neighbor's camera captures audio of what sounds like a whimper, followed by a loud thud. At 4:07 a.m., DM opens her bedroom door for the first time and hears what she describes as a male voice saying something that sounds like, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." At 4:08 a.m., DM opens her door again and sees the masked figure walking down the hallway. At 4:09 a.m., the sliding glass door closes. At 4:10 a.m., a dog starts barking in a nearby house. At 4:12 a.m., the white Elantra is seen on a surveillance camera leaving the area at high speed. At 4:17 a.m., a license plate reader on the highway captures the Elantra heading east. The entire attack, from entry to exit, took less than 15 minutes. 4 people were killed in less time than it takes to watch a television episode. DM's life has been irrevocably changed by what she witnessed. She has not spoken publicly about her experience, and her identity has been carefully protected by law enforcement and the courts. Court documents refer to her only by her initials. Friends have described her as struggling with guilt that she survived, guilt that she did not call 911 immediately, guilt that she did not do more. She has received counseling and has been surrounded by a support network of family and friends. but the weight of what she saw and what she lived through is something that no amount of counseling can fully lift. She is expected to be the prosecution's star witness at trial. Her testimony, describing the man she saw in the hallway, the sound of his voice, the way he walked past her, will be some of the most dramatic moments of the trial. The defense will cross-examine her aggressively, challenging the accuracy of her memory and the reliability of her identification. She will have to relive the worst night of her life in front of a courtroom full of strangers. And she will do it because she is the only living person who saw the killer's face. On a warm February afternoon in 2017, two girls walked across a railroad bridge in rural Indiana, recording a video on one of their phones. That video would become the most haunting piece of evidence in modern true crime because it captured the voice of the man who was about to murder them. And for nearly 6 years, no one could figure out who that voice belonged to. This is the story of the Delphi Murders. The Monon High Bridge stands over Deer Creek in Carroll County, Indiana, just outside the small town of Delphi. It is a railroad trestle built in the late 19th century from weathered timber and rusted steel, stretching for nearly a third of a mile across a wooded ravine. The bridge has been abandoned for decades. No train has crossed it in living memory, but it has become a local landmark, a destination for hikers and photographers and teenagers looking for adventure. The bridge is not safe. The wooden ties are old and rotting. There are gaps between them wide enough to fall through. To walk across the Monon High Bridge is to take a risk, a small one for most people, but a risk nonetheless. The locals know this. They cross it anyway because it is a rite of passage, a test of nerve, something you do when you grow up in a small town and need to prove something to yourself. The bridge rises about 60 feet above Deer Creek below. In February, the water is cold and fast-moving, swollen by winter rains. The trees along the ravine are bare, their branches forming a gray lattice against the pale winter sky. The ground is muddy and soft. It is not a forgiving landscape. The ravine itself is steep and wooded, the kind of place where sound does not carry the way you expect it to. A shout from the bridge would be muffled by the trees, absorbed by the damp earth, lost in the rush of the creek below. On February 13, 2017, the weather was unseasonably warm. The temperature climbed into the upper 40s, practically a heat wave for an Indiana winter. The snow had melted. It was the kind of day that tricks you into thinking spring has come early, the kind of day that makes you want to be outside. Abigail Williams, Abby to everyone who knew her, was 13 years old. She was quiet and artistic, the kind of girl who loved animals and drawing and spending time outdoors. She noticed the small things that other people missed. The way light fell through the trees, the sound of water moving over rocks, the pattern of frost on a window pane. Her family described her as shy and sweet, a little bit timid, but fiercely loyal to the people she loved. She loved horses and cats. She was a Girl Scout. She liked making crafts and watching horror movies, ironically enough. She had a gentle soul, the kind that made people want to protect her. Liberty German, always called Libby, was 14 years old. She was outgoing and sharp, with a quick wit and a confidence that made her seem older than her years. Her family described her as wise beyond her years. She was the kind of teenager who took charge of situations, who thought on her feet, who was never at a loss for words. She loved photography and was the documentarian of their friendship, the one who always had her phone out capturing moments. Her older sister Kelsey described her as attached at the hip to her, often calling her mom because Kelsey had helped raise her. Abby and Libby were best friends. They met in 2nd grade and were nearly inseparable from that point forward. They had sleepovers constantly. They loved the same music, the same movies. Abby often stayed at the German home and was considered part of the family. Libby was the bold one, the one who took charge, who made decisions. Abby was the thoughtful one, the one who noticed things, who felt things deeply. Together, they balanced each other perfectly. Delphi, Indiana is the kind of place that defines the American Midwest. population just under 3,000. A county seat with a courthouse square, a few churches, a diner that serves breakfast all day. The Wabash and Erie Canal runs through town, a relic of the 19th century, now a historical attraction where tourists can take canal boat rides in the summer. There is a museum dedicated to the town's history, a public library with a children's reading room, a high school where everyone knows everyone. It is a community where people grow up, leave for college, and often come back to raise their own families. The crime rate in Delphi is low. Before February 2017, the most serious crime in recent memory was a burglary or two. The town had never experienced a homicide. The idea that two young girls could be murdered in broad daylight on a popular hiking trail was beyond comprehension. It was the kind of thing that happened in big cities, not in a small Indiana town where people left their doors unlocked and children played outside unsupervised. When the news broke, the town went into shock. People gathered at the high school and at the churches. They held vigils, they cried. They asked questions that no one could answer. Who would do this? Why? How could it happen here? The Delphi Police Department, a small agency with limited resources, immediately recognized they needed help. The Indiana State Police were called in. The FBI sent agents from the Indianapolis field office. The investigation would become one of the largest and most complex in Indiana history. February 13, 2017, began like any other day for Abby Williams and Libby German. It was a Monday. The girls were off from school, a snow day, or a professional development day for teachers depending on the source. Either way, a free day in the middle of winter. The kind of unexpected gift that feels like a small adventure. Libby spent the morning at home with her father Derek and her sister Kelsey. She and Abby made plans to meet up and go hiking at the Monon High Bridge trails. The weather was unseasonably warm, and the trails were a popular destination for locals looking to take advantage of the unexpected warmth. Kelsey offered to drive them. She dropped them off at the entrance to the trails near the Delphi Community High School at approximately 1:35 in the afternoon. The girls took photos on the way in. One of the last photos of Abby alive shows her walking across the Monon High Bridge, silhouetted against the winter sky. She is wearing a black hoodie and blue jeans, her body angled as she navigates the uneven railroad ties. The photo was posted to Snapchat. What happened in the hours that followed has been reconstructed from fragments of evidence, phone data, witness statements, and the recording on Libby's phone. At approximately 2:07 p.m., Libby's phone recorded the last normal activity, the Snapchat photo of Abby. After that, the data activity changed. At some point between 2:07 and 2:30, the girls encountered a man on the bridge. He was walking toward them, his hands in his pockets, his head down. Something about him made Libby uncomfortable enough to start recording. She pulled out her phone and began a video recording, 43 seconds that would become the most famous piece of evidence in the case. At 2:32 p.m., Libby's phone placed a call to 911. The call lasted about 3 minutes. No one spoke to the dispatcher, but the phone was still recording audio, and it captured sounds from the crime itself, including the man's voice saying the now famous words. Kelsey arrived at the meeting point at approximately 3:30 that afternoon. The girls were not there. She waited. She called their phones. No answer. She drove home and told her father. By 5:30, a search party had been organized. Family members, friends, and local residents fanned out across the trails, calling the girls' names into the growing darkness. Libby's father used a phone tracking app to locate her phone near the Monon High Bridge area. The search continued through the night. Volunteers moved through the woods with flashlights, their beams cutting through the darkness. At approximately 12:30 p.m. on February 14th, Valentine's Day, a volunteer searcher discovered the bodies. They were found approximately 50 to 80 feet from the north bank of Deer Creek, about a third of a mile downstream from the Monon High Bridge. The discovery was not publicly announced until later that day, but everyone involved knew that the search was over and that the outcome was the worst imaginable. Libby's phone was recovered from the scene. On it, investigators found a video recording approximately 43 seconds long. It captured the image of a man walking on the Monon High Bridge, dressed in a dark jacket with his hands in his pockets, his head down. The video is grainy. The man's face is partially obscured by the angle and the lighting, but the audio is clear, A male voice speaks 7 words, "Guys down the hill." Those 7 words became the most analyzed piece of audio in modern true crime. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit examined the recording. Voice analysts studied it. The county prosecutor described the voice as the voice of God, calm, commanding, authoritative. The man who spoke those words was directing the girls off the trail into a more secluded area. And Libby, even in her terror, had the presence of mind to record it. The audio also captured other sounds, voices in the background, rustling, the sounds of movement. Investigators would spend years analyzing every detail of the recording, trying to extract every possible piece of information. The area where the bodies were found is a small gravel bar on the edge of Deer Creek, surrounded by wooded slopes and dense underbrush. The girls had been killed with a knife. The cause of death was sharp force trauma to the neck. But there were other details about the scene that puzzled investigators. The bodies had been moved after death. Objects were arranged around them, sticks, branches, pieces of bark placed in what some believed was a deliberate pattern. Branches were positioned over and around the bodies in a way that did not seem natural. Some of the branches appeared to have been arranged in the shape of symbols. Investigators kept these details confidential. Only the killer would know them. And for years, those details were the key that could be used to verify a confession. The image from Libby's phone was released to the public. It showed a man walking on the bridge, a man who became known as Bridge Guy. The audio of Down the Hill was played on news programs across the country. The public was asked to help identify the man in the photograph. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of tips poured in. Every lead was investigated. Every tip was followed. No one could identify him. In July of 2017, 5 months after the murders, law enforcement released a sketch of the suspect. It was based on a witness who had seen a man on the Freedom Bridge, a nearby pedestrian bridge, acting suspiciously earlier that day. The sketch showed a younger white male with a round face, short brown hair, and a slight smile. The witness had described him as creepy. No one recognized the sketch. 2 years later, in April of 2019, law enforcement released a second sketch. This one was completely different. It showed an older man in his 40s or 50s with long wavy hair, a large nose, and a more angular jawline. This sketch was based on a different witness, a woman who had seen a man near the Monon High Bridge around 200 to 2:30 in the afternoon, walking with purpose, mud on his pants, appearing out of breath. The 2 sketches bore almost no resemblance to each other. The public was confused. Which one was accurate? Had investigators made a mistake? It would not be until 2022 that law enforcement admitted the 2 sketches were based on 2 different witnesses who had seen 2 different people, and that neither man was necessarily the killer. As the investigation continued, a new lead emerged that seemed promising. A man named Keegan Kline was operating a catfishing operation on social media. He would create fake profiles, posing as a handsome teenage boy, to solicit explicit photos from underage girls. One of the fake profiles he used was called Anthony Shots on Instagram, Snapchat, and Kik. In the weeks before her death, Libby German had been communicating with the Anthony Shots account. She had messaged with this persona and, according to some reports, may have arranged to meet someone at the trails on the day she died. Investigators pursued this lead aggressively. Keegan Kline was arrested and held on multiple charges related to child exploitation. His home was searched. His phone and computer were examined. He was interrogated multiple times. But as the investigation progressed, Kline was ruled out as a suspect in the murders. GPS data from his phone placed him at his home in Peru, Indiana, 45 miles from Delphi during the critical hours. He was a predator, a liar, a manipulator of young girls. But he was not a murderer. In the fall of 2022, a document was filed in court that changed the course of the Delphi case and sent shockwaves through the true crime community. The document was called the Franks Memorandum. It was 136 pages long. It was filed by the defense attorneys of a man who had not yet been publicly identified as a suspect, Richard Allen. The purpose of the memorandum was to challenge the evidence against Allen, arguing that the real killers were still out there and that law enforcement had covered up the truth. The memorandum contained details about the crime scene that had never been made public, details about sticks arranged in the shape of runes, ancient Norse symbols, about a tree with a symbol carved into it, about the bodies being staged in a particular way that suggested ritualistic elements. The memorandum alleged that these details pointed to a group of Odinists, practitioners of an ancient Norse religion, being involved in the murders. It named names, including a former police officer who had Odinist tattoos. It claimed that law enforcement had known about the Odinism angle early in the investigation, but had deliberately failed to pursue it. The document was accidentally uploaded to the public court docket by a court clerk. It was quickly removed, but not before media outlets downloaded it. The Odinism theory spread like wildfire through social media, true crime forums, and news programs. Law enforcement pushed back against the theory, insisting that the evidence did not support a ritualistic interpretation. The prosecution called the theory ridiculous, but the damage was done. The Delphi case was no longer a straightforward murder investigation in the public mind. It was a conspiracy, a cover-up, a story with dark forces lurking beneath the surface. The trial judge eventually ruled that the Odinism evidence could not be presented to the jury, citing a lack of foundation. But the theory had already captured the public imagination, and it has refused to let go. On October 26, 2022, law enforcement arrested a man named Richard Allen. The arrest stunned anyone following the case. Richard Allen was not on anyone's radar. He was not mentioned in the leaks or the theories or the online speculation. He was, by all accounts, an ordinary man living an ordinary life in Delphi, Indiana. Allen was 50 years old. He worked as a pharmacy technician at the local CVS, filling prescriptions and helping customers. He lived in Delphi with his wife Kathy. He had a daughter who was now an adult. He was a grandfather. He was known in the community as quiet and unremarkable, the kind of person you saw every day and never thought twice about. He was 5 feet 4 inches tall, with a heavy build, thinning hair, and an unassuming presence. The break in the case came from an unlikely source. A conservation officer named Randy Allers was reviewing old tips in the Delphi case when he came across a misfiled tip from September of 2017. The tip came from a woman who said she had seen a man matching the bridge guy description on the day of the murders. She had named Richard Allen. The tip had been misfiled and never properly investigated. Allers followed up. He contacted Allen and asked him to come to the station for an interview. Allen agreed. In the interview, Allen initially said he had not been at the trails on February 13, 2017. But faced with inconsistencies, he changed his story. He said he might have been there between 1:30 and 3:30 in the afternoon. He said he parked at an old Farm Bureau building, walked to the bridge, watched for about 10 minutes, and left. He said he was wearing a blue jacket and blue jeans, matching the description of bridge guy. He said he saw 3 younger girls, but not Abby and Libby. Investigators did not believe him. The key piece of evidence came from a search of Allen's home on October 13, 2022. In a drawer, investigators found a handgun, a Sig Sauer Model 229, chambered in .40 Smith & Wesson. The gun was examined by forensic analysts who compared it to an unspent bullet that had been found at the crime scene between the bodies of Abby and Libby. The bullet had been chambered and ejected without being fired. The process left microscopic markings on the cartridge, ejector marks, unique to the gun that had cycled it. The FBI lab and the Indiana State Police lab both examined these markings. Both labs concluded that the markings on the unspent bullet matched the markings produced by Richard Allen's gun. The bullet was the single most important piece of physical evidence in the case. There was no DNA linking Allen to the crime scene. There were no fingerprints. There were no witnesses who saw him commit the murders. But the bullet connected him to the spot where the girls had died. What happened after Richard Allen's arrest would become one of the strangest chapters in the entire Delphi saga. Allen was held at the Westville Correctional Facility. While there, he made a series of phone calls that were recorded, standard procedure in correctional facilities. He also wrote letters. The calls are bizarre. Allen calls his wife Kathy. He is crying. He says, "Kathy, I confess. I did it. I killed Abby and Libby. I need to tell the truth." He calls his mother, Janice. He tells her, "Mom, I need you to know I killed those 2 little girls. I'm sorry for everything." His mother responds, "Rick, don't say that. You don't need to make up stories." He writes letters to his wife describing details of the crime, details that match the evidence. He mentions the knife. He mentions making them walk down the hill. He mentions tying them up. But sometimes in the same call or the same letter, he contradicts himself. He says he does not remember. He says he blacked out. He says he was coerced. He says other people were involved. The defense argues that the confessions are unreliable. Allen was held in solitary confinement without adequate mental health support. He was on heavy antipsychotic medication. His mental state deteriorated. He may have been suggesting himself into believing he did it. The prosecution argues that the confessions are genuine. Only the killer would know the details that Allen described. His voice on the recordings is not the voice of a confused man. It is the voice of a guilty man confessing. The truth of what Richard Allen said in those prison calls is still being debated in courtrooms and in the court of public opinion. In November of 2024, nearly 8 years after the murders, Richard Allen's trial began. The courtroom was moved to Fort Wayne, Indiana, due to the intense publicity in Carroll County. Judge Francis Gull presided. The prosecution's case rested on 3 pillars. First, the unspent bullet. The FBI and state labs both testified that the markings on the bullet matched Allen's Sig Sauer pistol. The defense challenged the chain of custody and argued that the bullet could have been planted or contaminated, but the prosecution's experts were confident in their findings. Second, the prison confessions. The prosecution played the recorded phone calls for the jury, Allen's sobbing confessions to his wife, to his mother. The prosecution argued that these were the words of a guilty man finally telling the truth. Third, Allen's own admission that he had been on the trails on the day of the murders, wearing a blue jacket that matched the description of Bridge Guy. The defense's case centered on the Odinism theory, despite the judge's ruling that much of the evidence could not be presented to the jury. The defense argued that the bullet evidence was unreliable, that the confessions were coerced, and that the real killers were still out there. The trial lasted several weeks. On December 13, 2024, the jury returned a verdict. Guilty on all 4 counts. Richard Allen was sentenced to 130 years in prison. He will never walk free. Libby German's phone captured 7 words. Those 7 words became the most famous piece of evidence in the Delphi case. They were played on news programs, dissected by audio experts, analyzed by linguists. They became the subject of countless analyses, theories, and debates. But they were more than just evidence. They were a testament to Libby's presence of mind. In the moment when most people would panic, when a stranger was approaching them on a deserted bridge, when danger was clearly present, Libby German started recording. She had the instinct to document what was happening, to preserve evidence that might one day lead to her killer. Her recording is the reason Richard Allen is in prison. It is the reason the case was solved. It is her legacy. The case did not end with the verdict. In January of 2025, Allen's attorneys filed an appeal with the Indiana Court of Appeals. The appeal argues that the trial judge improperly excluded the Odinism evidence, that the jury should have been allowed to consider the possibility that others committed the murders. The appeal also challenges the admission of Allen's prison confessions, arguing that they were coerced and obtained in violation of his constitutional rights. In March of 2025, a new development emerged. A ballistics expert hired by the defense re-examined the unspent bullet and concluded that the markings could have been produced by any gun of the same make and model, not necessarily Allen's specific weapon. The defense filed a motion for a new trial based on this new analysis. The appeal is ongoing. Oral arguments have not yet been scheduled. Allen remains incarcerated at the Indiana State Prison. The families of Abby Williams and Libby German have been transformed by the case. Libby's sister Kelsey has become the public face of the family. She has a podcast called Justice for Abby and Libby and has written a book about her sister. After the verdict, she said, "We finally have justice. It doesn't bring them back, but it holds the monster accountable." Libby's father, Derek, spoke at the sentencing. He said, "You took my best friend, you took my daughter, but you will never break our spirit." Abby's mother, Carrie, gave a victim impact statement through tears. She said, "Abby was my light. She was taken too soon. I will never forgive you, Richard Allen." The families have formed a nonprofit organization called the Bridge of Light Foundation, which funds safety education and supports families of missing children. They have worked with local authorities to improve trail safety, adding cameras, better lighting, emergency call boxes. The verdict brought closure, but not complete answers. Several questions remain. Did Allen act alone? The Odinism theory suggests he may have had help. His own confessions are contradictory, sometimes saying he blacked out, sometimes insisting other people were present. What was the motive? Why did a grandfather and pharmacy technician walk onto the Monon High Bridge on that February afternoon and kill two teenage girls? The trial offered theories but no definitive answer. And then there is the question of what happened in the ravine. The full details of the crime scene have never been fully released. Some details were presented at trial under seal. Others remain sealed indefinitely. The public may never know exactly what happened at the base of the Monon High Bridge on February 13, 2017. The Monon High Bridge still stands over Deer Creek in Carroll County, Indiana. The ties are still rotten. The gaps are still wide enough to fall through. In the summer, the ravine is green and overgrown, the creek running low and quiet. In the winter, the trees are bare and the wind carries a sound like nothing else. On warm days, people still walk the trails. They come from across the country to leave flowers and pay their respects at the memorial. They stand on the bridge and look down into the ravine, trying to imagine what happened there. They listen for the echo of 7 words, "Guys, down the hill." The man who spoke those words is in prison. Justice has been done, as much as it can be. But the voices of 2 young girls were silenced on February 13, 2017. And all the justice in the world cannot bring them back. Their names were Abigail Williams and Liberty German. They were 13 and 14 years old. They were best friends. They were taken too soon, and their voices, 1 recording, 7 words, will never be forgotten. On the day of the murders, several people were on or near the Monon High Bridge trails. Their accounts pieced together a picture of the afternoon. A woman walking her dog on the trails reported seeing a man near the bridge around 2 p.m. She described him as walking with purpose, not like someone out for a casual hike. He was wearing a blue jacket and jeans, and his pants were muddy. He appeared to be out of breath, as if he had been walking quickly or running. This woman's account was used to create the second suspect's sketch in 2019. Another witness, a teenager who was also hiking the trails, reported seeing a man matching the bridge guide description near the Freedom Bridge, a pedestrian bridge about a half-mile from the Monon High Bridge. She described him as creepy and said she had a bad feeling about him. Her account was used to create the first sketch in 2017. A third witness reported seeing a man parked in a vehicle near the trailhead. The vehicle was described as a dark-colored sedan. The witness saw the man sitting in the car, not getting out, just sitting there. It was only later, after the murders were discovered, that this sighting took on significance. None of these witnesses were able to identify Richard Allen from a lineup. The descriptions were too general, but together they helped investigators build a timeline of the afternoon, the comings and goings on the trails, the people who were there, the man who seemed out of place. The Delphi investigation was one of the largest in Indiana history. At its peak, it involved dozens of FBI agents, Indiana State Police detectives, and local law enforcement officers. The case generated over 50,000 tips, each one requiring follow-up and documentation. Investigators interviewed hundreds of people, family members, friends, teachers, neighbors, anyone who might have information. They checked every registered sex offender in a 50-mile radius. They collected DNA samples from dozens of persons of interest. They analyzed phone records, social media accounts, and credit card transactions. The investigation was hampered by the limited resources of the Carroll County Sheriff's Office, which had never handled a homicide investigation before. The sheriff at the time acknowledged that the department was overwhelmed. Evidence was mishandled, tips were misfiled, leads that should have been followed were lost. The misfiled tip about Richard Allen, the one that took 5 years to surface, is perhaps the most egregious example. A woman had named Allen as a potential suspect in September of 2017. The tip was logged but never followed up. It sat in a file cabinet for 5 years until a conservation officer reviewing old tips happened to find it. If that tip had been followed in 2017, Richard Allen might have been arrested years earlier. The families of Abby and Libby might have had justice sooner. The investigation might have gone very differently. The Franks Memorandum was filed on February 26, 2024. It was 136 pages long. The document alleged that the crime scene contained evidence of a ritualistic killing performed by practitioners of Odinism, an ancient Norse religion that in its modern form has been associated with white supremacist prison gangs. The memorandum claimed that branches at the crime scene were arranged in the shape of specific runes, including the Futhark rune for Fehu and Hegel. It claimed that a tree near the bodies had a symbol carved into it, the Valknut, a symbol associated with Odin. It claimed that a former law enforcement officer who was among the first on the scene had Odinist tattoos and connections to Odinist groups. The document alleged that law enforcement had known about this evidence from the beginning, but had deliberately suppressed it. It claimed that investigators had steered the case away from the Odinism angle to protect the reputation of the police department and the community. The leak of the Franks memorandum, accidental though it was, changed the public perception of the Delphi case overnight. What had been a tragic but straightforward murder investigation became a dark conspiracy involving secret societies, ritual murder, and police corruption. The prosecution has consistently denied these allegations. They say the sticks and branches were nothing more than the random debris of a wooded area. They say the symbols were coincidence or misinterpretation. They say the Odinism theory is a fantasy created by a defense attorney desperate to save his client. The truth may never be known. The jury in Richard Allen's trial never heard the Odinism evidence. It was ruled inadmissible. The appeal may change that, or it may not. The town of Delphi has never fully recovered from what happened on February 13, 2017. The once sleepy community of 3,000 people was thrust into the national spotlight, and it has never fully emerged. For years, the case divided the community. Neighbors suspected neighbors, friends turned on friends. The online speculation brought outsiders who treated the town as a spectacle, posting theories on social media about who might be the killer. The knowledge that Richard Allen was among them for years has been particularly hard for the community to process. He worked at the CVS on the main street. He filled prescriptions for his neighbors. He shopped at the same grocery store. He attended the same community events. He was a familiar face, someone who waved hello from his front porch. And all the while, according to the jury, he was the man who killed Abby Williams and Libby German. That knowledge is a weight that the town of Delphi will carry for generations. Libby German's phone captured 7 words, but the significance of that recording goes far beyond the words themselves. In the history of criminal investigations, there are very few cases where the victim has managed to record her own killer. The recording is almost unique in American crime history. Libby's presence of mind, her instinct to document what was happening, even as she was being led to her death, is extraordinary. The recording served multiple purposes. It provided an image of the suspect. It provided a voice sample. It established the timeline of the encounter. It proved that the girls were alive and in the presence of the suspect, and it captured evidence that would be used to convict the killer 8 years later. Libby's family has said that she was the kind of person who thought on her feet, who took charge of situations. The recording is proof of that. Even in her terror, she was thinking ahead. She was trying to leave evidence. She was trying to ensure that whoever did this would be caught. She succeeded. The recording is the reason Richard Allen is in prison. It is her legacy. The trial of Richard Allen was one of the most closely watched in Indiana history. The courtroom in Fort Wayne was filled to capacity every day. The families of Abby and Libby sat in the front row, present for every moment of testimony. The prosecution called a firearms expert who testified about the unspent bullet. The expert explained in detail how the ejector marks on the cartridge matched the extractor in Allen's Sig Sauer pistol. The defense cross-examined aggressively, pointing out that the bullet had been handled by multiple people before being tested. The expert acknowledged the chain of custody was not ideal, but maintained that the match was definitive. The prosecution also called the corrections officers who had monitored Allen's phone calls. They testified that the recordings were made in the normal course of prison operations, and that Allen had been advised that his calls were being recorded. The defense argued that the calls were obtained in violation of attorney-client privilege, and that the conditions of Allen's confinement had made his confessions involuntary. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when the prosecution played one of Allen's recorded phone calls for the jury. His voice, crying, confessing, saying, "I killed Abby and Libby," filled the silent courtroom. The families of the victims sat motionless. Several jurors appeared visibly affected. When the recording ended, the silence seemed to stretch for a full minute before the judge called for a recess. The unspent .40 caliber Smith Wesson cartridge was found between the bodies of Abby and Libby during the initial crime scene investigation, or rather, it was not found initially. It was discovered later, during a second search of the area, by a retired conservation officer who was volunteering with the search team. This chain of custody issue became a major point of contention. The defense argued that the bullet could have been planted or that it could have been dropped by one of the searchers. The prosecution argued that the bullet was mixed in with the debris of the forest floor and simply had not been spotted during the initial search. The forensic analysis focused on microscopic markings left on the cartridge when it was chambered and ejected from a firearm. These markings, called breech face marks and extractor marks, are unique to individual guns, like fingerprints, but for firearms. The prosecution's expert testified that the markings on the cartridge matched Allen's gun to the exclusion of all other weapons. The defense's own expert later challenged this conclusion, arguing that the markings could have been produced by any gun of the same make and model. This disagreement between experts is now at the center of Allen's appeal. Before his arrest, Richard Allen lived a quiet, unremarkable life in Delphi. He had worked at the CVS pharmacy for years, a job that put him in contact with dozens of community members every day. He was known as a reliable employee who showed up on time and did his work without complaint. His wife, Kathy, was a school teacher. They lived in a modest house about 2 miles from the Monon High Bridge. Neighbors described them as a normal couple. They kept to themselves, maintained their property, and were never the source of any trouble. After his arrest, Allen's life changed completely. He was held in solitary confinement at the Westville Correctional Facility, a maximum security prison. The conditions of his confinement have been the subject of legal battles. The defense argued that isolation and lack of mental health care caused Allen to deteriorate mentally, leading to the false confessions. Kathy Allen has maintained her husband's innocence. She has attended every court hearing, sitting in the front row directly across from the victims' families. She has said in interviews that she does not believe her husband killed anyone, and that his confessions were the product of mental illness exacerbated by the conditions of his confinement. The families of Abby and Libby have channeled their grief into action. The Bridge of Light Foundation, named for the Monon High Bridge, funds safety education programs and supports families of missing children. The foundation has raised hundreds of thousands of dollars since its inception. The foundation also works with local authorities to improve trail safety. Since the murders, the trails near the Monon High Bridge have been equipped with security cameras, better lighting, and emergency call boxes. The bridge itself has been reinforced in sections, though it remains as dangerous as ever. Libby's sister Kelsey has become a prominent advocate for child safety and victims' rights. She has written a book, started a podcast, and speaks publicly about her sister's life and legacy. She has said that her goal is to ensure that Abby and Libby are remembered not for how they died, but for how they lived. Abby's mother, Carrie, has been more private, but she has participated in foundation events and victim impact statements. She has described her daughter as her light and has said that the only consolation is knowing that Richard Allen will never hurt anyone else. The search for Abby and Libby on the evening of February 13, 2017, was a community effort. Friends, family members, and neighbors gathered at the trailhead, organizing themselves into search parties. They spread out across the trails, calling the girls' names into the growing darkness. Flashlight beams cut through the trees as volunteers pushed deeper into the woods. Libby's father, Derek German, was among the searchers. He used a phone tracking app on his own phone to try to locate Libby's device. The app showed the phone's location near the Monon High Bridge, but the signal was weak and the location was approximate. He led a group toward that area, pushing through the underbrush, calling his daughter's name. The search continued through the night. By midnight, the temperature had dropped into the 20s. The ground was wet and cold. Volunteers rotated in and out, warming up in their cars before going back out. No one wanted to stop. No one wanted to be the one who gave up. Just after noon on February 14th, a volunteer searcher, a retired fish and wildlife officer, found them. He was working his way along the north bank of Deer Creek when he saw something in the brush. He did not call out. He did not approach. He turned and walked back to the trailhead to report what he had found. The confirmation that the girls were dead hit the community like a physical blow. Parents held their children closer. Friends wept openly. The town of Delphi, which had never known a murder in its history, was now the site of a double homicide involving two of its youngest residents. When law enforcement released the image of Bridge Guy and the audio of Down the Hill, they believed the case would be solved quickly. Someone would recognize the man in the photograph. Someone would recognize the voice. Tips would pour in and the killer would be identified within days. Instead, the tips poured in, but nothing came of them. Thousands of people called, emailed, and submitted tips online. Each one was investigated. Each one led nowhere. The man in the photograph seemed to have no identity. He existed only as a grainy image on a phone screen. The audio was played on national news programs. Voice analysts studied it. The public listened and listened, but no one could identify the speaker. The voice was described as deep, calm, commanding. The county prosecutor called it the voice of God, but it was also, apparently, the voice of no one anyone knew. Years passed. The investigation continued. The image of Bridge Guy became one of the most recognized suspect photographs in American history. It was shared millions of times. It was analyzed, enhanced, debated, but it never led to an arrest. Richard Allen is serving 130 years in the Indiana State Prison. He will be eligible for parole after serving 125 years, effectively a life sentence for a man who was 52 years old at the time of his sentencing. But the case is not over. The appeal filed in January 2025 argues that Allen's trial was fundamentally unfair. If the Indiana Court of Appeals agrees, Allen could receive a new trial. If the appeal is denied, Allen's attorneys could petition the Indiana Supreme Court and, eventually, the United States Supreme Court. The appeal process could take years. In the meantime, the families of Abby and Libby will continue to wait. They have waited 8 years already. They will wait as long as it takes. The Monon High Bridge still stands. The memorial at the trailhead still receives visitors, and the recording on Libby German's phone, 7 words captured in the final moments of her life, continues to echo through the American consciousness. Guys, down the hill.